She was called the English Rose, the brightest jewel of Queen Victoria's descendants. Beloved in Britain, adored in Sweden, destined to be queen. Yet on a spring morning in 1920, at just 38 years old and heavily pregnant, Princess Margaret of Connaught was carried out of Stockholm's royal palace in silence. Both she and her unborn child were gone. But whispers spread quickly. Was it illness or something darker? Had the English rose been plucked too soon by fate or cut down by hidden hands within the palace? Today, we revisit the forgotten end of Princess Margaret of Connaught, the royal rose who blossomed for Europe, only to wither behind palace walls. She was born into history, wrapped not in silence, but in expectation. On January 15th, 1882, at Bagshot Park in Surrey, England. Princess Margaret Victoria Charlotte. Augusta Nora entered a world that was already watching her. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the child of Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, and Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. Her very first breath tied two great dynasties together, the British crown and the Prussian eagle. The court called her the English Rose, not just for her beauty, though that was undeniable, but for her symbolic purity. Fair-skinned, bright-eyed, with a gentle presence that seemed to radiate innocence, Margaret was the kind of princess Victorians loved to imagine, soft, virtuous, and untouched by scandal. To her grandmother, Queen Victoria, she was both a comfort and a promise. After the turbulence of the mid-19th century, this new generation of royals would represent stability, continuity, and grace. But beauty in royal circles is never just beauty. It is currency. It is destiny. And from her earliest days, Margaret's life was treated less as her own and more as a carefully written chapter in the saga of empire. Her childhood unfolded under the strict but affectionate care of her parents. Prince Arthur, known for his military career and discipline, believed in duty above all else. Princess Louise Margaret, though Prussian by birth, embraced the British way of life, instilling in her daughter the manners and virtues expected of a granddaughter of Victoria. Margaret and her siblings, Arthur and Patricia, were educated not merely in languages and etiquette, but in the unspoken rules of monarchy, composure, restraint, and the art of being watched without ever revealing too much. Bagshot Park, with its sprawling gardens and quiet halls, was both playground and classroom. In family photographs, Margaret appears composed even as a child, her posture straight, her gaze steady. While other children might laugh or squirm, she seemed already aware that her life was not hers to waste. To be royal was to be a portrait, and Margaret learned early how to hold still. Yet, within the rigid expectations, there were glimpses of something more tender. Those who knew her recalled a warmth that cut through the cold air of duty. She adored animals, often seen with dogs at her side. She had a love for painting, sketching flowers and landscapes with delicate precision, as if trying to capture fleeting beauty before it vanished. And she was known for her laughter, light, unforced, a sound that softened even her stern father's face. Her grandmother, Queen Victoria, took a particular interest in her. The old monarch, widowed and often cloaked in grief, found comfort in the presence of her grandchildren. Margaret, with her gentle smile and eager obedience, became one of her favorites. Victoria's diaries note moments spent with dear little Margaret, reflecting how even the most powerful woman in the world craved the innocence of youth as a balm against the weight of empire. But beneath this affection lay a deeper truth. Margaret was being raised not just as a daughter, but as an instrument of dynasty. Every lesson in posture, every carefully chosen book, every choreographed appearance was designed with a purpose: to charm, to unite, to one day marry well. By her teenage years, it was clear that Margaret had become what her family intended, a picture of grace. Her beauty was often described in glowing terms. Roses in her cheeks, golden brown hair, an air of gentle reserve that made her both approachable and untouchable. Newspapers would later call her the very ideal of an English princess. She seemed to embody a nation's pride, and yet, as with so many royals, there was a shadow in her destiny, because Margaret's life was never meant to belong to her. It was a thread to be woven into the fabric of alliances, treaties, and political bargains. Her charm was not just her own, it was Britain's tool. History has a cruel way of disguising pressure as privilege. To the outside world, Margaret was living a fairy tale. Grand halls, glittering gowns, the love of a powerful grandmother. But within the palace, she grew up knowing that every smile she offered, every step she took, was rehearsed for an audience far larger than herself. She was, from the beginning, both girl and symbol, both child and sacrifice. And in the gardens of Bagshot Park, among roses carefully pruned and displayed, Margaret learned the most brutal lesson of all, that even the loveliest flowers are cultivated not for themselves, but for others to admire, and eventually to pluck. By the early years of the 20th century, Margaret had become one of the most sought-after princesses of Europe. She was beautiful, well-educated, and above all, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. That lineage alone made her a prize. Courts whispered her name, envoys speculated, and newspapers hinted at possible alliances. She was the English rose, ready to be transplanted into foreign soil. In 1905, fate and politics brought her to Egypt. There, amidst the exotic backdrop of Cairo's gardens and sunlit palaces, she met Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, heir to the Swedish throne. Their encounter was, in many ways, a collision of worlds. She, a daughter of Britain's empire, he the future king of a Nordic kingdom steeped in its own traditions. Yet those present recalled an instant connection. Gustav Adolf was captivated by her warmth, her intelligence, her gentle manner. Margaret, for her part, saw in him not only duty, but kindness, an anchor in the uncertain waters of dynastic life. What began as courtly formality soon bloomed into something rare in royal circles: affection. Unlike so many arranged unions, theirs carried the shimmer of romance. Letters exchanged spoke not of treaties or dowries, but of shared dreams and tender devotion. When their engagement was announced, both London and Stockholm celebrated. It was more than a marriage. It was a diplomatic bridge between two nations. The wedding took place later that year at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The scene was a spectacle of empire. Banners unfurled, choirs soaring. The great families of Europe gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling. Margaret, radiant in white lace, walked down the aisle carrying not just flowers, but the weight of two monarchies. For Britain, she was a daughter leaving home to strengthen ties abroad. For Sweden, she was a promise of renewal, a link to the prestige of Queen Victoria's dynasty. From the start, Margaret embraced her new role with sincerity. Moving to Sweden, she exchanged the familiar rhythms of English life for the harsher climates of the north. The Stockholm palace was colder, more austere than Windsor's gilded halls. But Margaret brought with her warmth. She filled the palace with art, music, and flowers. She engaged with charities, especially those focused on children and health, quickly earning admiration from the Swedish people. Newspapers nicknamed her Margareta, the smiling princess. She did not simply marry into Sweden, she endeared herself to it. Yet beneath the public image, expectations tightened around her. As crown princess, her foremost duty was clear: to produce heirs. This was not a suggestion, but a command written into the marrow of monarchy. Within a few short years, she bore 5 children, each arrival celebrated as a reinforcement of dynasty. Gustav Adolf, Sigvard, Ingrid, Bertel, Karl Johann, each child a future, a safeguard, a proof that the bloodline would continue. But with each birth, the toll grew heavier. The radiant English rose began to show signs of wear. Friends remarked that she seemed more fragile, her figure thinner, her complexion pale after long recoveries. Still, she smiled. Still, she fulfilled her role, appearing at ceremonies, greeting dignitaries, embodying the image of royal grace. In her private letters, however, she confided exhaustion. "I often feel more a vessel than a woman," she once wrote. A confession hidden behind closed doors. Gustav Adolf adored her. But even love could not shield her from the relentless pressure of position. Every pregnancy carried risk. Every risk was accepted, because failure to produce heirs would be considered a betrayal, not of her husband, but of the nation itself. And so Margaret endured, quietly, dutifully, sacrificing her health for the throne she would never wear. Still, the people saw her as a beacon. She modernized court life, encouraging more openness, reducing stiff formalities, inviting artists and intellectuals into palace circles. Sweden began to see her not merely as a foreign princess, but as its own queen-in-waiting. The promise of her reign shimmered on the horizon, a monarchy infused with compassion, artistry, and the human warmth she carried so effortlessly. But destiny, as ever, is crueler than hope. For every rose that blooms brightest, there is always the shadow of the frost. In Margaret's story, that frost was already gathering. Her health, worn by years of childbirth, began to falter. And by 1920, with her 6th pregnancy underway, the delicate balance of her life, so carefully maintained, would collapse. The English rose had taken root in Nordic soil. She had blossomed. She had been loved. She had given Sweden a dynasty and Europe a bridge. But the very body that made her valuable to the crown would soon betray her. And when it did, it would take not only her life, but the future she was meant to reign over. The morning of May 1st, 1920, broke over Stockholm like any other. Cold, gray, heavy with the weight of spring that had not yet shaken off winter. But inside the royal palace, the atmosphere was charged with dread. Crown Princess Margaret, heavily pregnant with her 6th child, had taken ill. At first, the court physicians whispered of fatigue, the natural exhaustion of a mother worn by repeated childbirth. But by the end of that day, she was dead. 38 years old, a life cut in the middle of its bloom. And with her, the unborn child who would never see light. The announcement came swiftly. The court stated that Margaret had succumbed to sudden complications from an operation, an infection of the sinuses that had spread, leading to blood poisoning, sepsis. The explanation was clinical, cold, wrapped in medical terms that offered no comfort. But the shock was immediate and overwhelming. How could this happen to the English rose? She had been seen only days before, smiling faintly as she walked in the palace gardens, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. There had been no public sign of grave illness, no warning to prepare for tragedy. And now, gone. The city of Stockholm fell silent. Church bells tolled, black drapes were hung, and the people wept for the princess they had claimed as their own. In Britain, News reached Windsor and Buckingham with the sting of disbelief. Queen Victoria's beloved granddaughter, the woman destined to wear Sweden's crown, had died not in old age or battle, but in the sterile confines of a surgical room. But the story, as always in royal courts, did not end with the official statement. Almost immediately, rumors took root. Some whispered that the doctors had been negligent, that the sinus operation had gone wrong. Others hinted at something darker, that Margaret had been deliberately poisoned. Who would profit from her death? Who stood to gain if the English rose never bloomed into Sweden's queen? The questions multiplied. To the public, the explanation of sepsis seemed plausible enough. Medicine in 1920 was still fragile, antibiotics not yet available, surgical infections all too common. Yet those close to the court noticed the speed with which the narrative was locked down. The medical files sealed, the discussions silenced. No inquiry, no second opinions, no open grief beyond what was permitted. And so suspicion grew. Margaret's death came at a sensitive time for Sweden. The monarchy was navigating a modernizing society where Republican sentiments simmered beneath the surface. Margaret, with her warmth and popularity, had been a vital asset. Her charm kept the crown approachable. Her English lineage tied Sweden to Britain's vast empire. Without her, Gustav Adolf stood exposed, less beloved, more vulnerable. Could there have been factions within the court who saw her as too powerful, too foreign? Or perhaps, as some whispered in hushed voices, her very fertility, the endless cycle of pregnancies, had become her undoing. A body pushed beyond its limits, a life demanded by dynasty, a rose forced to bloom too often until the stem finally broke. The newspapers of the day tread carefully. Obituaries praised her grace, her charity, her role as mother of five. They wrote of her gardens at Sofiero, where she had planted roses and wildflowers, blending English sensibility with Swedish soil. They spoke of her smile, her gentleness, her devotion. But none dared linger on the mystery. None dared question the cause. For those who loved her, the silence was unbearable. The quick burial, the sealed records, the absence of deeper investigation, all felt like betrayal. How could such a radiant life vanish with so little scrutiny? In private, whispers turned into theories. Some pointed to her precarious health after repeated childbirth. Others recalled her operation, a routine sinus procedure that spiraled into catastrophe. And then there were those who, mistrusting the cold machinery of monarchy, insisted she had been silenced for reasons political, her death too convenient to be mere chance. In the palace, Gustav Adolf was shattered. The man who had once found light in her laughter was left with 5 young children and a throne growing nearer. He wept not only for his wife, but for the future she would never see, the crown she would never wear, the reign they were meant to share. For Sweden, it was the loss of more than a princess. It was the loss of hope. Margaret had symbolized a softer monarchy, one open to people, rooted in warmth. Her death left a void that ceremony could not fill. For Britain, it was a cruel irony. The granddaughter of Victoria, raised in grandeur, educated to rule, had died not in triumph, but in the shadows of infection. The rose of England, planted in foreign soil, had withered before it could become queen. History would later call it tragedy. But in the moment, it felt like something worse. Erasure. Because in that sealed hospital room, amid whispers of poison and sepsis, one thing became terribly clear. Margaret of Connaught had been more than a princess, more than a wife, more than a symbol of empire. She had been human, and in the most human way possible. Through frailty, through sickness, through silence, she had been taken. The bells rang, the flags drooped, the palace gates closed, and Europe, stunned, moved on. The death of Princess Margaret was not simply a personal tragedy. It was a political earthquake. Behind the veils of mourning, behind the black banners that draped Stockholm, there lingered an unspoken question. Who gained from her absence? In monarchies, death is never just death. It is calculation. It is rearrangement. It is opportunity. Margaret had been more than a wife to Gustav Adolf. She was a bridge to Britain, a symbol of modern monarchy, a mother who had secured 5 heirs to Sweden's throne. She was, in every sense, indispensable. And yet, almost overnight, she was gone. Her body buried, her name hushed, her presence erased. The void she left was not merely emotional, it was political. In the court of Stockholm, whispers spread in the marble corridors. Without Margaret, Gustav Adolf stood alone, more vulnerable than ever. He was respected, yes, but he lacked the warmth that had endeared his wife to the people. Where she had softened the crown, he seemed austere, rigid, distant. Her popularity had shielded him. Now that shield was gone. And in politics, absence is as powerful as presence. There were those within Sweden's nobility who saw Margaret's death as convenient. She had been foreign, an Englishwoman in a Nordic court, carrying with her the influence of Queen Victoria's legacy. Some feared that her ties to Britain gave her too much sway, that she might tilt Swedish policy toward London rather than Stockholm. Without her, the crown was once again purely Swedish. Others speculated about succession. Margaret had already provided heirs. Her eldest son, the young Prince Gustav Adolf, later Duke of Västerbotten, was seen as promising. But what of her unborn child? Had it been a boy, it might have reshaped the line of inheritance. By dying before birth, that child never threatened the delicate balance of dynastic politics. A grim thought whispered in corners that death had simplified what life might have complicated. And then there was the matter of control. Margaret had been outspoken in small but meaningful ways. She supported causes outside the rigid expectations of the monarchy, charities for children, efforts to modernize court life, even subtle reforms in how the royal family engaged with the public. These acts, gentle as they seemed, made her popular but also disruptive. To some, she was refreshing. To others, she was dangerous. Foreign diplomats noted the irony. In their private cables, they described Margaret as both beloved and isolated. One British envoy wrote, "Her Majesty the Crown Princess is adored by the Swedish people, but within the palace she walks alone." Her English heritage, once celebrated, now marked her as an outsider. She was never fully theirs, never fully trusted. Even in her role as Crown Princess, she bore the invisible weight of suspicion. And so, when she died, the silence felt orchestrated. Too quick, too precise. The funeral was dignified but swift, the record sealed, the narrative controlled. Sweden presented her death as unfortunate but unremarkable, a medical mishap, nothing more. But to those watching, it seemed like something else, the deliberate closing of a chapter. For Gustav Adolf, the loss was devastating on a personal level. But for the monarchy, it was almost useful. With Margaret gone, the Swedish crown could reshape itself without her influence. The children she bore remained as heirs, her duty fulfilled, her political presence extinguished. What then was her death? Accident, sacrifice, or elimination? It is impossible to know. But what is certain is that Margaret's absence shifted the balance of power in Stockholm. The monarchy continued, its machinery grinding forward, indifferent to the petals that had fallen. To the people, she remained the smiling princess, the English rose who had brightened Sweden's cold winters. But within the palace, she became something else. A problem solved, a foreign voice silenced, a reminder of how swiftly love and hope can be buried beneath protocol and power. History often paints queens and princesses as ornaments, fragile, replaceable, symbolic. Yet Margaret had been more than that. She had been a force of life within the palace, a presence that softened its stone. And her death revealed the truth hidden beneath the surface. That even the most radiant rose can be seen not as beauty, but as threat. In the corridors of El Escorial, centuries earlier, another royal had died in silence. Don Carlos, the prince erased by his father. Margaret's fate, though gentler, echoed the same pattern. A life once celebrated, gradually reduced to an inconvenience. And when the moment came, history moved on as if she had never been there. The English rose, cut before she could wear her crown, left behind only questions. Questions that no monarch, no court physician, no sealed archive has ever dared to answer. Funerals are meant to console, to honor, to give voice to grief. But Margaret's funeral was something else entirely. It was a performance of silence. In the first days after her death, Stockholm was draped in black. Flags flew at half-mast, church bells tolled, and the streets outside the palace filled with mourners. Crowds gathered, not in rebellion, but in stunned disbelief. This was the English rose, the woman who had charmed them, who had planted gardens at Sofiero, who had smiled at children during public processions. She had become their queen in waiting. And now she was gone, taken without warning. The palace responded quickly, efficiently, almost coldly. A state funeral was organized, dignified but brief. The cortege moved with solemn precision, the coffin draped not in color, but in restraint. There were no long vigils, no outpouring of official emotion. Instead, there was choreography. A queen-to-be, buried not with triumph, but with control. Margaret's coffin was carried through Stockholm Cathedral, the great organs swelling with music that filled the vaulted space but could not disguise the tension. Foreign dignitaries bowed their heads. The Swedish royal family moved like statues, their grief hidden beneath polished etiquette. Even Gustav Adolf, devastated as he was, kept his composure. A prince cannot break in public, even when burying his wife. And then, too soon, it was over. Within days, Margaret was laid to rest. There was no extended mourning period, no long remembrance in the official gazettes. The palace shifted focus swiftly, almost uncomfortably, back to matters of state. Newspapers that once printed pages of photographs and tributes now reduced her memory to brief notes. Her image, once radiant on postcards and in shop windows, began to fade. Why the rush? Why the eagerness to move on? Whispers suggested that the speed was intentional. The monarchy could not afford prolonged speculation. Already rumors of poisoning and negligence were spreading. Already foreign papers hinted at intrigue. The longer the mourning, the louder the questions. And so, the court did what monarchies often do when threatened. It buried not just the body, but the conversation. The medical records were sealed. Official explanations remained vague, unchallenged, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. Even today, historians note the frustrating lack of documentation. We know she underwent sinus surgery. We know sepsis was cited as the cause, but we do not know the details, the conditions of the operation, the exact treatments attempted, the timeline of her decline. These absences are louder than the words on the page. For the Swedish people, the silence was suffocating. Margaret had not been a distant figure. She had walked among them, smiled at their children, embraced their traditions. They wanted answers. Instead, they were given ceremony. They wanted mourning. Instead, they were given restraint. In Britain, the reaction was equally muted. The granddaughter of Queen Victoria, buried far from Windsor, became a footnote in the royal archives. Official bulletins expressed sorrow, but no suspicion. In an empire scarred by war and struggling with political change, there was little appetite for scandal. Margaret's death became one more silent loss in an age already soaked with grief. Yet silence has its own power. Those who were there remembered the emptiness, the way conversations stopped when her name was mentioned, the way servants whispered of rooms left untouched, gardens left to wilt, photographs quietly removed from display. It was as if the palace wanted to erase the presence of a woman who had once been its brightest light. One courtier, writing privately, observed, "It was as though she had been too loved, and thus too dangerous to be remembered." The silence after Margaret's funeral did more than conceal. It suffocated. It robbed her children of open remembrance, forcing them to grow in a palace where their mother's absence was acknowledged only in whispers. It robbed the public of closure, replacing grief with unease. And it robbed Margaret herself of what every human being deserves: the dignity of being remembered for who she was, rather than what she symbolized. Because funerals are not just about the dead. They are about the living, about the stories we choose to carry forward. In the case of Margaret, the story was buried with her, sealed away in archives, wrapped in silence. And yet, silence is never complete. It leaves gaps, and in those gaps, suspicion thrives. The English rose had been laid in her grave, but her memory was not at rest. The people who had loved her, the children she had borne, the court that had feared her influence, none could escape the shadow of her absence. In Stockholm, spring turned to summer. Flowers bloomed in Sofiero's gardens, the very ones she had planted with her own hands. They bloomed, but she was gone. And so the silence of the palace was broken not by words, but by roses, living reminders that beauty can be buried, but never entirely silenced. A crown once hovered within reach. For 15 years, Princess Margaret of Connaught lived as Sweden's crown princess, the wife of the heir apparent, the woman who would one day be queen. She had given the dynasty 5 healthy children. She had charmed the public. She had earned the trust of her adopted nation. By every measure, her path to the throne seemed assured. And yet, history would deny her. When she died in May 1920, Margaret's name vanished not only from life, but from destiny. She had been next in line to ascend the throne as queen consort beside Gustav Adolf. That vision, the radiant English rose crowned in Stockholm's cathedral, standing tall in state ceremonies, leading the monarchy into a new era, was gone in an instant. The irony was cruel. She had fulfilled every duty asked of her, borne the heirs that secured the dynasty, played her part with grace. But death had a way of undoing not only lives, but legacies. With Margaret gone, Sweden's future reshaped itself. The throne would eventually pass to Gustav Adolf without her. when he became King Gustav VI. Adolf in 1950. It was not Margaret who stood beside him, but his second wife, Lady Louise Mountbatten. Margaret's children grew into adulthood, her daughter Ingrid becoming Queen of Denmark, her sons carving their roles within and beyond royal life. Her blood continued in Europe's royal houses. And yet, Margaret herself, so close to queenship, was forgotten. Her story reduced to a tragic footnote. In official histories, she became little more than a line. Princess Margaret of Connaught, Crown Princess of Sweden, died 1920. No reign, no coronation, no enduring remembrance. She was a missing figure in the gallery of queens, a gap where a portrait should have hung. And so, the English rose was erased not by scandal, not by treason, not by abdication, but by silence. Her absence was keenly felt in the years that followed. Sweden entered a new era of monarchy without her warmth, without her soft touch that had made the palace more open, more human. Gustav Adolf reigned capably, but more reserved, more austere. The Queen Sweden might have had, the artist, the reformer, the beloved foreign bride, never was. For the children, the erasure was even more painful. They grew up with a mother who was never spoken of, at least not openly. Photographs of Margaret were quietly tucked away. Her name was not celebrated in anniversaries or state occasions. She had given everything to the dynasty. But the dynasty did not return the favor. And yet, the traces remained. In Ingrid, her daughter, one could see Margaret's grace, her determination. As Ingrid became Queen of Denmark, she carried a quiet echo of the mother she lost at 10 years old. In the gardens of Sofiero, where Margaret had planted flowers, roses still bloomed each spring, defying time and silence alike. But within the palace, she remained a shadow, an unfinished story, a queen who never was. It is striking how monarchy treats those who fall just short. A woman who becomes queen is immortalized. Her portraits hung in halls, her deeds recorded in annals, her likeness stamped on coins. A woman who dies before coronation, no matter how beloved, is set aside. She becomes not history, but almost history. A name remembered by few, forgotten by many. Margaret's fate reveals the cruelty of dynastic logic. To live as a symbol is to die as one. Once she could no longer serve the purpose of queenship. Her memory was gently, efficiently brushed aside. The English rose had been cultivated for bloom. Instead, she was clipped, pressed between the pages of history like a flower in a forgotten book. And so, when one looks at Sweden's line of queens, her name does not appear. Her crown was never forged. Her portrait was never painted in regalia. Her reign was never written. She stands instead in the margins, a reminder of how fragile destiny can be. How quickly even the brightest path can vanish in the fog of mortality. A single infection, a single operation, a single day in May, and a throne was lost forever. The news spread with the force of a storm. Stockholm awoke to church bells tolling in muffled cadence, each strike echoing the loss of a princess who was no longer simply a foreign-born bride, but the nation's crown princess, its future queen. Across Sweden, from fishing villages on the Baltic coast to iron towns deep in the forests, people whispered the same words. She is gone. The English rose is gone. The palace curtains were drawn. Black drapes hung from the gates. In the grand chapel, candles burned day and night, their light trembling in the draught as though the air itself grieved. Inside, courtiers walked softly, speaking in half-formed sentences, their eyes red with exhaustion. And at the center of this storm stood Gustav Adolf, no longer the hopeful husband with a radiant partner at his side, but a man hollowed by loss, clutching at his children as though they were the last threads tethering him to the world. Margaret's funeral became an event of international mourning. From London came telegrams of sorrow, written in the clipped, formal style of royal households, but carrying beneath them the weight of true grief. Queen Mary of Britain sent condolences. King George V, Margaret's first cousin, ordered memorial services throughout the empire. Across the Channel, in Denmark, Norway, and beyond, monarchs who had shared laughter and kinship with Margaret now bowed their heads to a silence that felt unbearably heavy. The people of Sweden filled the streets dressed in black, their faces pale in the chill air of early May. They lined the route of her funeral procession, standing in absolute stillness as the cortege passed. Horses moved slowly, their hooves softened by cloth, so that the sound would not break the solemn quiet. The coffin, draped not only in the Swedish flag, but also in a wreath of roses, white and crimson, was carried through Stockholm like a fragile relic of something lost too soon. Observers wrote of the eerie contrast. Only weeks before, Margaret had been seen laughing, her cheeks bright in the spring sun, carrying herself with the energy of a woman deeply engaged with her adopted nation. And now, the streets bore witness to her absence. Mothers wept openly, whispering to their children about the kindness the princess had shown. War widows spoke of her charity. Nurses remembered her visits to hospitals during the war when she had rolled up her sleeves and worked beside them. Even hardened politicians, accustomed to navigating power without sentiment, allowed themselves the softness of grief. Yet beneath the mourning, questions lingered. Why had the death of a healthy woman in her prime, cared for by the best physicians of the royal household, happened with such suddenness? Rumors swirled that the infection was mishandled, that negligence, or worse, indifference, played a role. Some whispered of surgical error. Others spoke of deeper intrigue, suggesting that palace politics or the strain between Margaret and elements of the Swedish court might have hastened her end. None of it could be proven, but in the silence of grief, doubt took root. Her children, too young to grasp the finality of death, stood bewildered at the ceremonies. Gustav Adolf lifted his eldest son's hand, guiding him through the rituals of farewell, even as his own heart seemed to stagger under the weight of loss. Photographs from the time show their small figures beside the casket, an image that would haunt Sweden. The sight of heirs to the throne, motherless before their lives had even properly begun. In Britain, the grief was doubled. For the granddaughter of Queen Victoria had been not only a royal figure, but also a symbol of the enduring ties between the British Isles and the northern kingdoms. Newspapers carried somber portraits, writing of a life cut short, of a role never fulfilled. She had been destined to be queen, they reminded their readers, and now the destiny lay buried beneath the earth. When the funeral was done, when the last notes of the organ faded and the carriages rolled back into the mist of Stockholm, Sweden was left with a silence far heavier than any bells could carry. It was not only the death of a princess, it was the extinguishing of hope. For in Margaret, the people had seen not a distant aristocrat, but a woman who walked among them, smiled with them, and carried herself with the warmth of spring. And in her absence, they would discover that memory has a cruel habit. It does not stay still. It shifts, it fractures, it allows questions to grow where certainty once stood. The kingdom mourned, but also began to whisper. History is rarely a neutral storyteller. It chooses its favorites, elevates some voices while silencing others, sculpting memory like a careful gardener pruning roses in a palace courtyard. In the century that followed Princess Margaret's death, her story has often been brushed aside, not out of malice, but out of convenience. The 20th century was loud, filled with wars, revolutions, and shifting monarchies. Against such thunder, the quiet tragedy of one woman, however noble, however beloved, seemed too delicate, too private to command attention. Yet when we hold Margaret's life up to the mirror of modernity, the silence around her death begins to look less like respect and more like erasure. Women in royal narratives have often been confined to archetypes: the dutiful consort, the tragic beauty, the mother of heirs. Margaret was all of these, and yet she was more. She was educated, artistically gifted, politically aware, and deeply engaged in humanitarian causes. But because she never became queen, her influence was clipped short, her story left unfinished. In many ways, her fate foreshadows the ways history still treats women, remembered through the men they married, the children they bore, or the crowns they nearly wore. The details of her medical crisis, an embolism during sinus surgery while pregnant, are technical, clinical, stripped of emotion. What is lost in this reduction is the human dimension, the exhaustion of years of pregnancies, the strain of public duties, the isolation in a foreign land. Margaret's death is often summarized as a line in a medical report. But behind that sterile sentence was a woman who laughed, who painted, who wrote letters filled with wit and longing. When we re-examine her death today, we cannot ignore the broader context of medical history. The early 20th century was a dangerous era for childbirth and surgery alike. Infections, embolisms, and postpartum complications claimed countless women, rich and poor, royal and common. But in Margaret's case, the tragedy is sharpened by irony. Modern medicine, which was supposed to protect her, became the very force that failed her. Her operation for chronic sinus problems was routine for its time, yet the timing, late in pregnancy, proved fatal. It is a reminder that progress can still be lethal when ambition, expectation, and medical risk collide. Some historians frame her death as symbolic, the fading of one royal bridge between Britain and Sweden at a time when Europe was unraveling. Others interpret it through the lens of gender politics, seeing in Margaret's silenced story a reflection of how easily female suffering is dismissed, especially when wrapped in royal decorum. And still others argue that the mystery surrounding her final hours, rumors of negligence, whispers of mismanagement, remain unresolved, not because the evidence was lacking, but because the will to investigate simply wasn't there. After all, a scandal in the royal nursery could shake dynasties. Silence was safer. Through a modern lens, Margaret's tragedy resonates far beyond palaces. It speaks to every woman whose health was overshadowed by duty, every mother whose exhaustion was dismissed as weakness, every life reduced to footnotes in someone else's story. Her death invites us to ask, how many women were erased by silence, their struggles buried beneath polite words and medical euphemisms? And yet, even in this shadow, Margaret's image lingers. Photographs of her smile, serene, radiant, seemingly unshaken, continue to circulate, often without context, as if her life was unbroken happiness. But to look closer is to see the hidden cracks, the tiredness in her eyes after childbirth, the solemnity in her gaze during wartime. These images, when re-examined, tell a different story, not of a rose in eternal bloom, but of one struggling against frost, fragile yet determined to open. Modern historians, feminists, and biographers now revisit her tale not as gossip, but as testimony. They see in her the outline of questions that remain painfully relevant. How do we remember women who never reached the pinnacle of power but carried its burdens? How do we honor those whose lives were curtailed by systems that prized heirs over health? And how do we peel back the polished veneer of royal storytelling to confront the human cost beneath? Princess Margaret of Connaught was not only the English rose who withered too soon. She was also a mirror, reflecting the silenced pain of countless women before and after her. And in recognizing her shadow, modernity offers her what her own time denied. A voice, however belated, in the long echo of history. When we strip away the crowns, the palaces, and the pageantry, what remains of Princess Margaret's life is something profoundly human. A story of a woman who tried to balance love, duty, and health, and who, like so many others, was broken by the weight of expectation. Her tragedy is not only royal, it is universal. It reminds us that history is not just written in treaties and battles, but also in hospital rooms, in silent suffering, in the fragile bodies of those who are expected to endure without complaint. Margaret's death at 38 is a sobering reminder of how little control individuals, especially women, often had over their own fates. She lived at a time when royal women were bound by invisible chains. They were the vessels of dynasties, the keepers of alliances, the producers of heirs. Their value was measured not in personal joy or well-being, but in the strength of the bloodline they extended. For Margaret, this meant 6 pregnancies in less than 15 years, layered atop constant public appearances and the unrelenting gaze of both Swedish and British courts. She fulfilled her role flawlessly, but her body finally revolted. The human message in her story lies in the tension between what was expected and what was possible. How many women across centuries have been told to keep smiling through exhaustion? How many have been urged to prioritize family, work, or reputation over their own well-being? Margaret's face, captured in photographs, can serve as a universal symbol of resilience, but also a warning of what happens when resilience becomes a demand rather than a choice. In the modern world, her story still resonates in quieter ways. Consider the countless women who die each year from complications in childbirth, even in developed nations. Consider those who are silenced by cultural norms that dismiss their pain, or by medical systems that do not take women's symptoms seriously. Margaret's tragedy, though wrapped in royal garments, is a window into a struggle that continues today. The undervaluing of women's health and the tendency to dismiss suffering when it is inconvenient. But there is also a gentler message in her legacy. Margaret was remembered by those who loved her not only as a consort or mother, but as a woman of warmth, humor, and deep kindness. Letters describe her as someone who made others feel seen, someone who laughed easily, someone who created moments of humanity even within the gilded cages of court life. This memory, fragile yet luminous, suggests that dignity is not erased by tragedy, that even when history reduces lives to footnotes, the kindness of a single person can ripple forward. To honor Margaret, perhaps we must look beyond the palace walls. We must see her as a daughter who never truly escaped the shadow of her grandmother, Queen Victoria. As a wife who carried the weight of another dynasty's future on her shoulders. As a mother who died with her unborn child still within her, leaving 5 young children to grieve a loss they could barely comprehend. And, above all, as a human being whose life reminds us of the delicate balance between beauty and fragility. Her story urges us not to forget the silent costs of expectation. It asks us to question the myths we are told about strength and sacrifice. Must strength always mean endurance at any cost? Must sacrifice always be demanded until nothing is left? Margaret's fate says otherwise. It says that when we fail to protect those who give most of themselves, we risk losing more than a life. We lose the love, the laughter, the humanity they could have continued to give. In this way, her memory becomes not only a tragedy, but a quiet form of resistance. By telling her story fully, we restore what history erased. By recognizing her exhaustion behind the smile, we give voice to all those who were never allowed to rest. And by mourning her too early death, we remind ourselves that every life, no matter how bound by duty, deserves to be remembered as more than a role played in service of others. Princess Margaret of Connaught's life may have ended in silence, but her message does not need to. It can speak still, warning us of the dangers of erasure, urging us to honor the unseen struggles around us, and calling us to remember that compassion must never be sacrificed to expectation. In giving her this recognition, we give her what she was denied in life, not only remembrance, but understanding. When the doors of the Swedish palace closed on May the 1st, 1920, the world had already begun to move on. Newspapers printed brief obituaries. Diplomats sent condolences. Court life resumed its rehearsed rhythm. Yet for the family Margaret left behind, 5 children suddenly motherless, a husband broken by loss, time did not so easily heal. For them, the absence of her voice at the dinner table, the absence of her touch on the children's heads, became a silence too heavy to escape. History often records kings and queens in terms of power. Wars won, treaties signed, crowns passed on. But what about the voices that faded in quiet rooms, far from battlefields, consumed not by ambition, but by exhaustion? Margaret's story matters precisely because it resists the grand narrative. It reminds us that history is not only about crowns, but about the bodies and lives worn down beneath them. She was a royal, but she was also a woman caught in a system that demanded too much and gave too little. And in that way, Margaret stands as a mirror. How many lives today are still measured by utility rather than humanity? How many still collapse under invisible weights while the world looks away? Her death may have happened a century ago, yet the lesson stretches forward. No crown, no dynasty, no duty should ever come at the cost of a person's health, dignity, or existence. What remains now is not the silence of her passing, but the choice of how we remember. We can choose to see her as another forgotten consort, a line in genealogies. Or we can restore her humanity, acknowledge her laughter, her exhaustion, her kindness, her endurance. By doing so, we resist the erasure that so often follows women in history, especially those who die young and leave little written testimony behind. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of Princess Margaret of Connaught is not simply that she died at 38, or that her unborn child never drew breath. The deeper tragedy is that she was denied the chance to grow old, to be remembered in fullness, to write her own ending. In telling her story now, we give back at least some of what was lost. We make space for her voice in the present, even if history denied it in the past. And so, as we close this chapter, let us carry with us not only sorrow, but also resolve. To remember those who history forgets. To ask harder questions about the costs of duty, of silence, of unrelenting expectation. And to honor not just the roles people play, but the human beings who live within them. Margaret's life may have ended in a palace chamber, but her story continues in us, in the telling, in the remembering, in the quiet insistence that no life, however fragile, is meaningless. This was the story of Princess Margaret of Connaught, the English rose, who withered in the Nordic court, her light extinguished at only 38. If you found this story moving, if you believe more forgotten voices from history deserve to be heard, then we invite you to join us. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, where we bring back the lives history tried to bury, and where every tragedy is told not to glorify pain, but to restore dignity. Because behind every crown is a fragile human heart, and those hearts, however quietly they beat, deserve to be remembered.